Two, three, four. Welcome to Off Panel, Sketch.com's weekly podcast. In this week's episode, our special guest is the artist of the upcoming Invincible Iron Man, David Marquez. Thanks for joining the show, David.
Hey, thanks, David. I'm very happy to be on the show.
Yeah. And I imagine this is a pretty exciting time for you because, I guess depending on how you judge it, I have to imagine like relaunching the Marvel Universe with Invincible Iron Man has got to. I would say it's probably the biggest book of your career so far, right?
Yeah, no, it's been crazy. I knew when Brian and I started talking about this. I mean, probably over a year ago, that they're wanting this to be a big relaunch of the book. I didn't expect it to be on the scale that it is,
Right.
Which is, I mean, it's a happy surprise, but it's also a daunting surprise.
We're doing what?
No, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, when they tell you that, we want this to be our flagship book, and then that becomes like, no, this is really our flagship book, and here are what the sales are looking like, and yada yada. It's just, it's more than I expected. And I mean, that said, I think that the product we're putting together is really, really good. So
Right.
I think it'll live up to expectations. We'll have to wait and see, but it's. The short version of that is, yeah, it's been nuts.
Yeah. Well, one thing. So I to prep, I was reading some of the stuff you've already said, and like I thought one thing that you said in a Marvel interview was really interesting, and you said it kind of feels more like a creator-owned project.
In a lot of ways, it does. I mean, it's important that this is not a creator-owned, and I'm under no illusions that we have that kind of control over it. But the for the most part, lack of like mandate from anybody has been really nice. And with Miles, it was kind of the same thing. Working on Miles Morales with Brian, we kind of got to do what we wanted to. Now, in that case, we were working in the Ultimate Universe, which
it's your own sandbox, more or less.
Exactly, yeah. And so it didn't have that many interactions with other books. In this case, I mean, our book is the first one out of the gate after Secret Wars. It lays down a lot of precedent that will be reflected in other books. But in spite of all of the interconnectivity of the Marvel Universe and the fact that it's a major property for Marvel, we kind of got to do what we wanted. I mean, even in terms of the design process, Brian and I, just between the two of us, we did a whole lot of revisions and dead end explorations of what to do with the character. But once we kind of had our idea wrapped up and we presented it, Marvel kind of said, "Oh yeah, sure, that sounds great."
Yeah.
So and that for me, it was shocking. I was expecting a lot more. Just spin it positively, hand-holding, or negatively. People have heard of editorial mandate,
Sure.
really dictating for a creative team what they do. I will say, as a quick caveat, that has never been my experience at Marvel. They've always been very good with me personally. But we all hear the horror stories from name whatever publisher. These things happen.
Right.
But they've been very, very not hands-off, but very supportive.
Right.
It's been involved. I mean, Tom Brevoort, our editor. We've had discussions and very long, thoughtful discussions with him about, should we go this direction or that direction regarding, any given small thing. But it's never been a, no, you guys can't do this, you have to do this instead. And that's been a very, very happy surprise.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, that's the type of stuff where, that's the type of thing where, greatness comes from in comics. Like being able to, I'm not saying that like, Marvel, if they're a little bit more have a little bit more editorial control, can't still make good comics. But I mean, having like unleashing somebody like you and like Brian on a book like that, and just kind of being able to feel your way out, and and figure it out with Tom, because Tom's been there forever. I mean, I interviewed him last year about. Do you remember those old Marvel Universe cards?
Yeah.
So I did an interview with him because he was one of the main people who was putting that together back in like 1989. I mean, that guy's.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah. So he was one of the main people to put those together, and like so he's been. I mean, he's one of those guys that like he knows Marvel in and out.
Oh yeah.
So it's got to be kind of cool being able to, rethink. I mean, I guess I don't know how drastic you guys are really taking Iron Man and Tony Stark and everything, but at the same time, it's cool to like be able to build up one of the icons, I guess, of the Marvel universe.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting to the first point you're making about the dangers of overbearing editorial control.
Sure.
there are lots of stories of when it's clear that the direction a book goes in was driven from editorial fiat rather than, creators getting to kind of, pursue their own muse for where the story goes. And I think there is a happy medium, but it definitely leans more heavily in favor of what the creators want to do for most cases. If you want to get a really compelling story out of creators, operating at, full throttle. And I mean, this is my first time working with Tom,
Right.
but from all of the secondhand and third-hand stories I've heard of him as an editor, he's one of these guys who takes his role as an editor very seriously.
Sure.
And by that I mean his job is, and maybe I don't want to speak for him, but this is what I experience on mine as a creator. He picks the team that will work well together, and when wanted or when needed, offers some guidance or some feedback, but doesn't dictate. And I think that's really kind of the best recipe for how to. I mean, a project where everybody feels as if there's a sense of goodwill that's being fostered.
Sure.
I think everyone is going to kind of do better. He does a great job of that. On the other hand, and I would say my experience with this has been much more on the when I was just first starting out and working at smaller publishers. A lot of times either inexperienced or maybe just the editors have a personality that leads them in this direction. They'll feel it's their job to really kind of control and micromanage the minutia of the project. And in my experience, all that does is foster resentment and a lackluster, diluted product. So
yeah.
Luckily, my experience at Marvel has been pretty much, I wouldn't say hands off, but usually they're kind of like, oh yeah, it looks great, keep going, I haven't had a whole lot of micromanaging stuff. But yeah, I mean, he's a great resource as well. And whenever I need, any bit of info, he's always, he doesn't have to think about it. He just, rattles up, oh, this, and look in this book, and it's right there. And
yeah,
it's really nice.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was talking to him about the cards, he was talking about how like Mark Grunwald, the old Marvel editor, he was talking about how like they would just go to him because he's the resource and he knew everything. Right. And he was talking to like all like about how he was just like this resource that knew everything Marvel. And I was kind of thinking, I kind of thought about mentioning, I was like, I kind of think you're him now.
I see. It's him on a Mark Waid and the Superman knowledge.
Oh yeah,
he wins that. But as far as Marvel goes, yeah, I think Tom has it down pat.
Yeah. Well, so one thing I'm curious about, and obviously Brian is a big name, but he's also been at Marvel for a very long time, and he's been on a lot of big properties and everything. You guys have been working together not for the entire time you've been at Marvel, but like a pretty good chunk, because you did a lot of the Miles Morales stuff, and now you're doing Invincible Iron Man, and it is actually kind of amazing, like to hear that you've been working on this book for a year. And when did we first hear about it? Like 4 months ago, 3 months ago?
Yeah. So I mean, you're right as far as like my tenure at Marvel. I think I started working there like December of 2010 or January of 2011. I did a fill-in on Secret Warriors, and then did the Fantastic Four Season 1 graphic novel. And right after that, I got picked up to work on as a fill-in on Ultimate Spidey, and then off to the races. Yeah. So that's been about 3.5 years working with him on that book. But so for Iron Man, I started drawing the book at the beginning of this year in terms of like doing concepting. I think maybe it was in either February or March. We finalized a lot of the concepts, and either March or April, I started drawing the first issue. But the first conversation we had, I think, was around, when was it? Sometime last summer. And at that point, it was just like a blip on the radar. Like, we knew at that point, based on the conversations that were happening at Marvel, that Secret Wars was going to happen, and out of that, there'd be new projects to work on. It was up in the air regarding exactly how Miles would carry on after that. But one of the options that had been presented to Brian was the idea of doing Iron Man, with essentially the mandate that they wanted to make this book into
the flagship.
The flagship, yeah, to have it play a similar role as it does in the film. If it's so successful in films and in other media, why can't we do the same thing with the comic? Right. And they've had very, very good runs with amazing creators, but the sales have never been exactly where they wanted them to be, at least not consistently. Right. And so, they figure, well, Brian is a name that sells books.
Right.
And if we can get a good creative team together, then they'd be rearing to go. And they gave him a list of names, and he offered me as one of the names. And they said, "Oh yeah, sure, great." Apparently, and I was like, "Oh, okay, great. I guess they do like me. Yay!"
I guess I'm doing Iron Man now.
Yeah, exactly. So, but he and I had even before that happened, we had talked about it. And I'll be honest, at first I wasn't sure. I had read. I didn't read a ton of Iron Man growing up. I read, the Warren Ellis, Adi Granov, Extremis storyline, and I had read a bunch of Matt Fraction's run with Salvador LaRocca, and at that point, I guess Kieran was writing Iron Man. They hadn't yet done Superior, or maybe it was right around the transition. But I hadn't read more than the first couple issues of that.
Yeah,
and it wasn't a character that I had a ton of like obsessive love for. Like I grew up obsessed with X-Men. I loved Spider-Man, but outside of that, I can't say it's a character that I was really really into. And I'd say, oh yeah, I'm definitely an Iron Man guy. But once the idea was kind of brought up, and Brian was like, well, he wouldn't want to jump onto a book without having like a good hook.
Yeah, sure.
On it, and so he kind of thought about it because it was an interesting idea, but we didn't really know like what would our version of that be. So we sat on it probably for like, I don't know, 6 months or so, just kind of every once in a while chatting about it. And eventually he finally came around. He's like, I've been thinking about it a whole lot, and I have my hook, and he pitched it to me. And I was like, this is actually a really intriguing idea.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if he said what it is, so I don't want to spoil.
No, that's fine.
And so at that point, I started sketching a little bit, and I started having kind of fun, kind of playing with the idea of drawing a lot more tech. And I went back and I reread all the way from Extremis up to everything that's been published up to that date. And I really got into it. Mm-hmm. And so for me, a big part of it was like once Brian got excited, then I found something to get excited to about it as well.
Yeah.
And so it's fun because like while I'm roughly familiar with the Iron Man mythos and his supporting cast and everything, getting back and rereading that and then going back to a lot of the older issues with the first appearances like Madame Mask and all that stuff, it's cool just like how much I got to discover a character's history kind of like for the first time in depth. Yeah. And that was a lot of fun. So at this point, I got to redesign a bunch of the core characters. We're introducing new characters, and that was a lot of fun as well. And going back to the idea of, this being a book that feels somewhat like creator owned, we're getting to create a lot of new content for the book.
Yeah.
And that is something I got to play with that a bit in the Ultimate Universe, but in that case, he was usually ultimizing, for lack of a better term, existing characters from the 616 or elsewhere.
Yeah.
In this case, it's generating characters from scratch, which it's fun just to kind of like ideate on the page,
right?
And so it's been a very like productive, creative experience and experiment. Because while I've worked on some smaller creator-owned properties, and on the side, I'm currently developing a few, both with writers and just kind of on my own for whenever I'm not working on a monthly book at Marvel and I have time to draw them.
Right.
But unlike when I came on to working on Miles, which I had a blast working on the book, and the character in the book mean a lot to me. More than just professionally, like just personally, I think it's a very important book, and there's a very kind of like special place in my heart for that. It was a book where I came on kind of a second fiddle, and while over the course of the 3 years working on it, I definitely feel as if like I got to claim ownership of it to a large degree. To the point where I feel if Sarah and Brian are Miles's like mom and dad, then I'm like the stepdad, I guess. I don't know.
You came in later and you raised them through puberty in the awkward years.
Exactly, yeah. And I don't know how deep into that analogy you want to dive.
Probably not too much more.
Exactly, yeah. This is a case where like this book and this version of Tony and and the Iron Man story, like this is Brian and my and Justin's baby,
Yeah.
And I really can see my DNA throughout the entire book.
Yeah, and I think that's really cool. I mean, it's great. Not everyone gets to say that they like launched a Marvel book, but a flagship, and like one that's Tony Stark, the man who more or less launched the empire of like the movie universe for one. But you get coming out
pressure,
of,
dude. Jesus.
I mean, you're gonna be defining everything from here on out. No, I'm sorry. Anyways, but I mean, I think that's really amazing, and I love the fact that you're getting to come up with new villains and like the fact you got to do a new armor armor. But one thing that I really like about your work and things that we've seen, previously in like Ultimate Spider-Man is like, the reason why I love Miles Morales isn't because he's Spider-Man. It's because Miles
Right.
Morales, the character himself, is. You guys had so many great moments where, like the characters shine through, and like all the stuff with his dad in particular was really really impactful stuff. And like, I don't know, I guess like the thing for Tony Stark, I'm with you. I wasn't for a long time. Like I had lots of old back issues, like Iron Man 200 through 225 or whatever, and I read them and I was like, as a kid I wasn't super into it, but like I really liked Fraction's run. I really liked Extremis and things like that. But a lot of the stuff I really liked about Fraction's run in particular was really kind of Stark the futurist and Stark the businessman almost.
Yeah.
And like, I don't know. I guess like, are you still, obviously there's the bombastic action and there's going to be the new armor and everything, but do you still feel like this is a really character based story still?
And this is Brian writing, and that's what Brian gets off on as a writer, and that's what I get off on as an artist.
Yeah.
So to answer your question, as clear as possible, absolutely yes.
Yeah.
We were talking kind of as we're getting the gears going for the book and kind of what we wanted the tone to be. We're kind of chatting, and I already knew the answer, but I asked him, and I'm like, you don't strike me as the kind of writer that would want this to be kind of like a tech porn book where it's all about like the nuances of the armor and all this kind of stuff. And he was like, oh no, absolutely not. Like there's a place for that, but those aren't the kind of stories that Brian tells. Brian is excellent at really kind of delving into an exploring character, and to the point where people. I've read a lot of critiques of his work, whether right or wrong, that will bemoan the fact that they don't feel as if there's a lot of plot happening, and you're not getting
decompressed.
There's that, but there's also the critique that. If you look at someone like John Hickman or Grant Morrison, where you had these, meticulously detailed plots where, the event from one next, and as you kind of get to kind of pick apart and see all the pieces fit together, like, oh, there's some really interesting stuff going on there. What Brian, well, I've seen him do that in some of his work as well. I mean, looking at Powers and some of the plotting that happens there as an example. What he does exceptionally well is make me care about characters.
Sure, yeah.
And to your point about Miles Morales, like whatever was going on in terms of the actual plot points and beats and the storyline for Miles, what I remember were drawing those moments where he was having these really intimate conversations and moments with his mom, with his dad, with Kate Bishop, with Genki,
Mm-hmm.
And with Tony in this story, we wanted this to be Tony's story. This isn't it's called Iron Man, but this is Tony's book.
Yeah.
And you're looking at the movies, the one that I think did this the best, and I think Brian has the same opinion as well from the conversations we've had, is Iron Man 3, far more than being an Iron Man movie, was a Tony movie.
Totally. It was like the PTSD Tony Stark movie.
Exactly, yeah. And that is that, and kind of the very end of the movie, there's a point where, Iron Man is destroyed, the mansion is destroyed, but it's just Tony and the screwdriver.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is everything kind of comes from him, from the character, and the fact that he can invent anything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of our starting point for the series. It's just Tony back to basics, getting in deeply into the character and just the fun. I mean, and not fun stuff as well. Adventure and danger and all that kind of stuff. But I'm kind of rambling at this point. But yeah, it's we're definitely focusing on character a ton.
Well, so it sounds like you're not. I mean, I'm not going to say that you're entirely not a tech guy, but it does sound like, generally speaking, you enjoy those character moments more. But so for you were the guy who redesigned his armor, and you were the guy who had to do that. Was that something that you immediately leapt onto and were just yeah, this is what I'm all about? Or was that something you really had to kind of get yourself into and figure out and I'm not trying to make it seem like you're not into it, but you know what I'm saying?
No, yeah. I get what you're saying. I had an opportunity to draw, a good amount of tech in the past, just as kind of as ancillary detail in the books that I've done. This is the first project I've worked on where it's really kind of front and center. But that said, I love designing stuff. Whether everyone loves them or not, I mean, you can't please everybody, but for me, it was exciting to get to do a lot of design work. Like I said earlier, well, actually, looking back at a lot of the projects I've done, I've got to do a lot of designing. For the Secret Warriors book that I did, I got to design a team that all got killed off in that issue, so that was fun. For the FF, season 1 book, I got to kind of do a subtle redesign, but a redesign for a lot of the characters in that. And then for the Ultimate books, I've done tons of redesign work. So it's something that I very much enjoy, and I like having the opportunity to do. For me, working on this book, well, I never had to say like yes, but only if I get to design everything.
Yeah.
I was very relieved that I got to design everything, because nothing is kind of worse than having to like
Draw someone else's design over and over.
Well, right, especially if it's a very difficult design to draw. I've had conversations with like Chris Anka and Jamie McKelvey, who I think are much better designers than I am, but we have kind of a similar attitude towards design. Is that designing for comics and designing for film and video games are very different things.
Right.
And a lot of artists, I think, will make the error of leaning really heavily into a lot of really awesome, concepting and character design from film and TV and video games, and then try to make it work in comics. And if you draw it on a cover, I'm sure it looks great. But if I have to draw like
over and over and over,
exactly, like that's just a pain in the ass. So
well, it seems like the design you went with is a lot more stripped down. It's like more sleek and like more plated oriented, as opposed to like it doesn't have like Gatling guns on the top or anything like that.
Right. And so in that case, like I'm kind of cheating in a way, because yes, absolutely, and that was one of my big goals. Is I want it to be kind of sleek and streamlined, not only because I don't want to have to draw a billion unnecessary lines every single time I draw the character, but also because if you look at just kind of the idea of technology over time, is it doesn't get bulkier and more complicated. Typically it becomes, or at least this is the progress over the past 50 years, it tends to get smaller and more, if not minimalist, then certainly more streamlined.
Sure.
Look at the iPhone versus a computer from the 1960s. Like, yeah. So there's that idea, and I mean, for me, honestly, probably the biggest design inspiration or influence was there's a new Lamborghini called the Aventador, and if you look at it, it kind of looks like the armor. It's kind of like hard angles and kind of nice edges, but it still kind of has some smooth roundness, sleekness to it. But yeah, I wanted the armor in its basic form to be sleek and kind of edgy in like the literal sense. But I'm cheating in the sense that because this is kind of like a big like Transformer Lego set, you can draw whatever the hell you want. And so it's been actually really fun watching all these variant covers roll in by guys like like Adi or like
Scotty Young.
Scotty Young's, yeah. Like they're kind of playing with, like, yes, that's what I want other artists to be able to do, because sure, maybe the baseline looks like this, but the point is you can draw it however the hell you want. It can look like the Hulkbuster, it can look like a submarine, it could turn into a giant Megatron gun, like whatever you want to do with it. I
liked how Scotty took it to like the absolute max.
Oh yeah, totally. And it's funny because as I've been working on the book, doing covers, this kind of stuff, I've taken a couple opportunities in covers people haven't seen yet to kind of show some of the transformation stuff. But I realized after seeing this other artist kind of like go to like the extreme, I'm like, oh, I'm being really conservative in how far I'm taking this. So next time you see me, there'll be like a giant like Star Destroyer.
That sounds amazing. Well, so one thing I really enjoy about following you on Twitter is just kind of like how it seems like you're really actively thinking about how comic craft, how artists work, and how you can tell a story better and everything like that. And I saw one thing that you and Brian were talking about that really, it kills me. Like you were talking, I think Brian said something about like, no one will remember your guys' run for anything besides this like one page you guys have in the third issue. And then you were talking about like how you're shocked that no one had ever done that before. But I'm curious, like because you are taking this is like a new direction and a new not a new Marvel universe, but like a new push for the Marvel universe. Like, are you trying to incorporate anything new or specific into how you tell this story?
I mean, interestingly, it's a difficult question to answer because I am a very easily bored artist.
Sure.
And I'm constantly like experimenting with new, integrating new panel layouts or new brush effects or, different ways of, composing and drawing. I'm always working on different ways of constructing anatomy. And it's, I'm fortunate that maybe because that's just part of how I think, I've never kind of grown complacent in my art. But at the same time, I also don't really have a tried and true system. Like it seems like a lot of artists have a tried and true system. You give them like something like Art Adams may be an example of this, and this is not meant to be a criticism at all. But if you look at Adams' Lady, like 25 years ago and today, you can tell it's the same artist, and they probably approached it in a very similar way,
right?
Because they figured out how to nail that really early on, and they ran with it. I'm not convinced that that the way I do anything right now is the right way of doing it.
Sure,
it's kind of just like this is a way, but I'm always looking for a better way. So part of my answer is yes. I am trying to integrate new things. I'm finding that as I'm working on this project, I'm surprising myself in the way I'm drawing things. Like, oh, I didn't expect to draw Tony's nose that way, but turns out this is the way I like drawing his nose. I don't mean that just in terms of like the structure of it, but like the way it's changed the way I draw noses.
Yeah,
and that's a weird thing. And every kind of new project I do, that process seems to happen. Like when I did fill-in pages on Guardians, it looking a whole lot different than when I was drawing Miles, and influencing the way I drew Miles. So there's that kind of constant evolution taking place. But at the same time, when I was working on Miles, I was going through a lot of like transition, for lack of a better term. And Brian, even when we would hang out and chat, he would comment on it. Like, it seems like you're trying to get somewhere. So if anything I can do in terms of the writing to help you do that, let me know. And so there's 2 flashback issues where I go in this crazy, like really brushy 80s style.
Oh yeah, that's the one where the dad is telling his story, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. That was so different for you.
And this is the kind of thing is like I was kind of pushing things in a very, very rough, like I'd been so clean and so tight. And so technical, I guess, in my style for so long. I wanted to kind of get out of that and do something really messy and dirty and grungy. But then the pendulum, after swinging that far off to the side, came back, and I went back to a much cleaner, simpler style, but bringing in some of that roughness along with me. So having gone through that transition with Miles, trying to get to my point, I found myself starting off on Iron Man. Like I really wanted to kind of get back to basics in a way, like simple, straightforward storytelling, not trying to knock out a huge ton of bells and whistles. So that's where I started off with Iron Man. But then I find myself doing other new things. Like, so I rely pretty heavily on, maybe rely is the wrong word. I utilize very heavily a lot of like 3D models for backgrounds.
Sure.
And the big thing with that is that, for one, I like building 3D models. It's fun. But also, if I have an environment I'm going to be using 20, 30 times.
You don't have to rebuild it over and over and over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I always embellish them and change aspects of it every time I draw it, but it's nice to know that the foundations are there to be used,
sure,
especially when I'm working on a book, having to finish a book every 4 weeks. So
well, then you also don't have people like on Twitter being like, "Oh, that was different this time. What'd you do?" And then you're like, "That won't happen because you have the 3D model."
It's funny. Yeah, absolutely. But I found myself for the first several issues of Iron Man, like drawing all the backgrounds and very, very crazy, elaborate backgrounds by hand. So yes, I am doing things differently. In some cases, like what I'm doing differently is I'm trying to kind of simplify and get down to clear, strong storytelling basics,
right?
And streamline my process, because I think that suits this book. But in trying to do that, something else is kind of happening instead,
right?
So, like I say, it's a hard question to answer. So it's yes asterisk, I guess.
No, that works. That works. Well, it is interesting. So, like the first thing I ever read from you was the second Days Missing series from Archaea.
Oh wow! Okay.
I'm OG David Marquez.
Jeez, man, I'm sorry. That stuff was. Well, I mean, looking back on it now, all I can see is all the mistakes. But thank you for reading that way back when.
Well, yeah, well, I'm very friendly with some of the people like Archaea. Or, well, I guess Boom now, but
yeah.
But anyways, and so like I had read that, and like that was the first thing, and like as you would probably readily admit, it is not the same as you are now, and it is cool to think about how, like, not only throughout your career, but even within projects you're working on, you're looking to evolve and to develop your style, not even your style, but how you tell a story, because like like I think a lot of people, when they think of like innovation with art, they're thinking like, oh, like crazy, like paneling, like like J.H. Williams III stuff,
right?
Where you're really like you're putting bat symbols into the page and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I like to hear that like what you're looking to do is like refine your storytelling and trying to find a better way to convey what's going on. Which for some people that like the J.H. Williams the third stuff is awesome. Like the stuff he did with Greg Rucka was amazing.
Oh, it's gorgeous. It baffles me like how guys like he and like Marco Rudy and like Mac and Sienkiewicz, the way they approach that stuff, it's amazing.
But if you did that for a Bendis book, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense.
I don't know that I can make it work. I mean, what's funny is, Brian and I both live here in Portland, and we get together, every week or every 2 weeks, kind of depending how our schedules work out, and just kind of hang out with a bunch of our friends. And Brian will often bring, comps of his recent books out, or if he has a new artist he's working with, he'll kind of bust out his iPad and show us some of the pages. Yeah. And it's invigorating and enraging in a way. Like I'm a very competitive artist as well, and Brian's constantly mocking me for this. That I view anybody not as like a rival, like for my job, but it's like, oh, that guy's doing better work than me. Screw that guy, and like it kind of lights a fire where I want to improve my own work, and so now he's kind of hesitant to ever show me art. So like he was showing me these pages that Marco Rudy was doing for Uncanny X-Men a while ago, and then he was showing me newer pages by Andrea Sorrentino, who's doing the Old Man Logan. Right now, and then he's also doing some like annuals, I think, for X-Men. Mm-hmm. And both these guys have very, very they have a crazy ability to do very, very intricate, elaborate, non-traditional layouts that also play a storytelling role in the way they integrate these layouts. And it's the kind of thing where I just have to sit back and marvel at it, because part of me is kind of like, oh man, I'm not trying hard enough. Another part is like, I'm trying to learn that I can appreciate guys where their brains just work that way and they're able to do it beautifully, and that arguably my strengths are more in telling a nice, clean story, and that nothing is wrong with that. Yeah. I was chatting with Mike Norton about this on Twitter, and about how, like, to a certain degree, some of us who try to emphasize in our own work so strongly really clean, clear storytelling, it can feel boring, or at least it's kind of like for those of us who really do appreciate that, it feels as if not everyone necessarily appreciates it as much as we do, which is interesting. I don't know. It's, for me, the biggest frustration or the danger maybe with my own experience trying to do non-traditional layouts. There are times where I've done it, I think I've done it fairly successfully. The other times I've done it, and I know the storytelling suffered as a result. Right. And as much as I love the J.H. Williams stuff, occasionally some of the storytelling isn't as strong as perhaps if it was done a little more straightforwardly. Right. Those cases are rare and far between. I'm by no means trying to call out J.H. Williams. His work is absolutely amazing, and I'm in awe of it. But definitely, when I try to do the same thing, to a certain degree, it feels like there's a tension. Like either I do a really interesting layout, or I tell the stories cleanly and clearly. And in many cases, perhaps there is a happy medium to be found there, but you are still trying to serve two masters in a sense.
Well, and we had kind of briefly talked about this on Twitter, and I think it's an interesting idea. Like we were talking about, kind of clarity in storytelling, and sometimes the struggle of people, like, for new readers. Like if a new reader picked up an average comic, let's just say, let's just say Ultimate Spider-Man. Like some people could even struggle reading that because they've never read a comic before. Right. But if they picked up like a J.H. Williams III book, or like a Marco Rudy comic or something like that, man, like I even struggled with Marvel Knights Spider-Man to a degree, because I was like, you're trying to figure out what's going on exactly. Yeah. It fit for the story, but at the same time, like I've been reading comics since I was 7. And if I handed that to my wife, she'd be like, No, I'm out. And it's like, it's an interesting thing because, I understand that everyone wants to push things, and that they don't necessarily want to, just go back to the status quo or anything like that. But I don't really perceive like clarity in storytelling, trying to tell the story as clearly as humanly possible while still like maintaining like, doing everything you want with the story. Like, I don't think that's necessarily an inherently bad thing, nor is it boring. I mean, there are boring ways to do it, but I think that there's a lot of benefit to it because it makes the story work better. And I guess to me, comics are more of a narrative than they are. They're an art form, but they're also a narrative. So it's kind of like the two sides fighting against each other.
Yeah, and without calling anyone out into the mat, like there are definitely instances of artists I know who they draw gorgeously, but occasionally I feel as if like the beauty of the art is allowed to trump the storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you know, I was referencing like J.H. Williams is not one of these people I think who does that. I think in most cases his design work and the storytelling marry really beautifully. But in my case, I mean, part of I guess what maybe not how I rationalize, but
Even as you're trying to crush your competitors.
Exactly. No. I guess I justify my not reliance on my faith in like the grid for storytelling in that I also like to draw pretty things, and I can use that. I can tell my story cleanly and still draw pretty things.
Yeah.
And have all my nice pretty drawings framed in a way. So I think that every artist has the thing that they like to do or the things they like to do in their work. J.H. Williams is a beautiful. He can render and paint beautifully. He is. I think he and maybe Stuart Immonen are the two artists I can think of who are the most flexible in terms of the styles they can produce.
Yeah, Stuart is unbelievable.
Oh, he's crazy. I mean, looking at stuff he did in like Secret Identity back in the day, and his Next Wave stuff, and then stuff he's doing now versus his Creator-owned stuff with Catherine, like incredible. And he's also one of the guys who does fairly non-traditional layouts. But some people really are into producing a wide range of styles, or are who like doing very dynamic non-traditional layouts, or like in my case, you like sticking to the grid, or the guys like doing widescreen comics, or guys who like doing 12, 20 panel page comics. And I think that in my case, I have to kind of try to fight the urge to do all of those things.
Right. Yeah.
But that said, you will see me trying out little aspects of it here and there, because I tend to get bored really easily and want to try things that that are new. And whenever you're experimenting, like, it's not always going to land perfectly each time. So it's a kind of a process of learning by doing, or learning as I do. So don't be shocked if you. Oh, so even as an example, so I tend to. Well, Brian likes to write 6-7 panel pages, and it can be a challenge, especially when I like drawing like lots of detail, to put in lots of detail and have 7 panels. But in one of the pages that's been shown, is a double page spread of Tony in the lab from Iron Man, and it's 24 panels, each one breaking down kind of like 3 moments. The first one into 8 panels, the second moment into 8 panels. So you have this kind of like atomization of time throughout each moment, and that was a fun chance to kind of really play with not a non-traditional layout, but playing with what comics does so well, which is playing with time and dragging out like the way time and space are kind of interchangeable, that you really don't have in any other medium. And I think maybe that's why so many artists at some point experiment with, if not absolutely go whole hog into the idea of playing with layout. It's because that is the thing that's unique to comics.
Yeah.
It's the way that we control the narrative. Because I mean, anybody can draw a picture, right? But what comics does uniquely is it takes pictures and then wraps it up into how much space you have to tell the story in, and the way you break that down, and how the space relates to time. So I mean, go read Scott McCloud. He talks about all this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think you guys are all wizards, to be totally honest. I'm like, I actually grew up wanting to be a comic artist, and I tried to do those things, and I'm just like, how do you guys do this? This is ridiculous.
It's hard. So a lot of I marvel at the ease with which so many artists seem to do this, because I feel as if every single page is always a struggle.
But it sounds like that kind of drives you to a degree, though.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a lot of us will talk about it in interviews and amongst each other about how there is every page is a problem needing solving.
Yeah,
and that is both a challenge. It can be fun. It can be horribly soul-suckingly depressing when it doesn't see every single panel is just fighting you.
Yeah.
It's very rewarding. I don't have a sense that I necessarily know what I'm doing. I mean, that's somewhat disingenuous. I'm confident that I have a system, for the most part, that allows me to get the problem solved.
But you're still figuring it out along the way.
But I'm always figuring it out. I mean, it's every page is a challenge. I'm never convinced the way I approach the page. Well, maybe not never. Most of the time, I'm not convinced that I approach it in the best way possible. But arguably, that's what drives me and so many other artists to draw the next page. Is well, if I didn't nail that page 100%, maybe I can nail the next one 1% better than I did the last one.
Sure. Have you ever read Deadly Class?
I haven't. No, I know the book, but I haven't read it.
Okay, well, I don't want to put you into a like undying rage, but you should check out Wes Craig's stuff in there, because he is like, as far as artists go that like manage to innovate and then also follow a really great structure for telling a story. That guy, like, I think he's one of the best right now because of just he's constantly, like what you're talking about, like you using paneling for time and everything like that. He does some amazing stuff where it's like time and motion and everything like that is worked into like small inset panels and everything working together. And it's
I'm googling it right now. I see what you're talking about. Yeah,
he's really incredible. He's one of my favorites right now. But actually, I was just looking at that 24 panel page. That is really fantastic stuff.
Oh, thanks.
And one thing that you were talking about recently on Twitter was you were talking about the idea of kind of like youth versus craft and how age can, kind of change an artist's work in dramatic ways.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting idea, but have you found that as you've aged, like, have you found that your art has changed in some ways, but do you find that, like, you were talking about how like craft kind of comes as you age? Do you find that you're relying more on craft now, or do you feel like you're still pretty innovative where you're at in your career? I know that's kind of a tough question to ask, but
it is. I'm trying to think of how I do have an answer. I'm trying to think of how to articulate it. I feel as if. So the point I was trying to make on Twitter, and I mean, I was really kind of just, rambling and navel gazing and procrastinating because I didn't want to draw that day, but. There is this phenomenon where you look at a lot of innovation in technology and science, but also in art, happens or comes from young creators.
Sure,
young people.
Absolutely.
And arguably one of the reasons why is that there's a certain lack of awareness of having to follow certain rules, or perhaps there's a certain innate creativity that comes with youth that as one ages. For a variety of reasons, people tend to grow more conservative and less tolerant of risk, perhaps. And within comics specifically, there's this kind of perception. Actually, it was a conversation you were having with Oliver Sava that kind of kicked this off in my head. Talking about how the idea, and I know he's a little bit younger, he's like 28 or so, but I think he referred to how that Marvel was a bunch of like old 30-year-olds or something, and I took a little bit of umbrage at that. I'm like,
I also took umbrage. I'm 31. I was like, what are you talking about?
But it did get me thinking, because I was kind of wondering, it's why is it that perhaps creatorship tends to skew older, especially at Marvel and DC. Not just them. Also, look at any entertainment media, and by and large, writers in writing rooms, I'm sure are not all going to be 22-year-olds.
Sure.
And I came down to the idea. Well, I think it does seem as if in order to have kind of to develop enough of a competence in a craft, it does take time. I mean, there's a whole 10,000 hours rule popularized by Malcolm Gladwell and others. Something that I wholeheartedly subscribe to. Basically said it takes 10,000 hours of dedicated effort and practice in order to gain mastery over a given subject or skill or whatever. And arguably the reason why you see a lot of artists really doing their best work happens in their 30s. Now that is not all of them, but I think if you're maybe 60-70%, I would say that's probably true, because throughout your 20s you're trying to figure out what the hell you're doing, and then by your 30s you've kind of reached the apex of that arc, and then who knows what happens? Maybe you're Sienkiewicz and you keep improving until you die, which hopefully will not be until many years from now, because I cannot wait to see what else he produces.
Right.
Or there are artists where a lot of people say there's kind of like the unfortunate kind of snickering behind their backs thing that you'll see happening at a certain point in someone's career where it seems as if what they were known for, they're no longer either producing that or that's no longer valued. That happens. But nonetheless, there's the idea, and for writing as well. Writing is such a technical craft, especially the way it's produced. It's both produced and viewed and valued now within comics, that I think it does take a good deal of time and effort before you see writers really kind of nailing not only how to write story, but how to write stories their way.
Yeah.
And this is something I've heard, Matt Fraction talk about a lot, Brian talk about a lot, really any writer. But all of that is in contrast to a lot of what I heard Oliver talking about, and this is true of a lot of creators as well. Maybe more here on the audience and readership side, but I'm not sure I really have a clear opinion of that. It's that there's a clamoring for a new younger voice in a way, and that you got me thinking about the whole idea of like, well, is there, if there's any truth to what I was saying about it takes a certain amount of time to develop craft, is craft necessary for good storytelling? Because you look at a lot of things like the great example of it, I think, is the creator of Attack on Titan. I'm blanking on his name right now. He's currently 28, and that book's been out for what, 5 or 6 years, maybe more. And looking at a lot of like just manga as an example, a lot of the very, very popular manga came out of creators when they were in their early to mid 20s.
Right.
And then there are, of course, savants, people who are producing very, very high, producing at a high level at a very young age. But there's also people who are producing stuff that maybe one could argue doesn't show the same sophistication, but for some reason just taps into the zeitgeist and has youthful energy that is just infectious.
Yeah.
And I'm somewhat rambling, but I guess the point I'm trying to get to is that, yeah, there is arguably there's a point there to what Oliver was saying, that I think it's understandable why publishers and companies want to have creators working for them who have not only like a proven track record, but also clearly a mastery of their craft. And to a certain degree, those are things that tend to come with age. Are they perhaps missing out on something by not, taking advantage of, or maybe by not seeking? And this is where I'm not sure even how to phrase it. Like, do you phrase it as like people who haven't developed their craft yet? Like, I don't know what that answer is.
Yeah, I mean, I totally know what you're saying though, because like, you can't just put any artist on, like Invincible Iron Man. Like,
Right.
I'm sure Marvel's list didn't have like some kid who's drawing like a webcomic or something like that, because you just can't do it from a business perspective. But even beyond that, like, is that person ready to draw a monthly comic? And,
Right.
and that's a huge consideration too. But I don't know. I mean, well, beyond a lot of the manga creators, because like, man, those guys, like, I will never stop being amazed by the fact that like Naoki Urasawa was making like 2 comics at a time, and they were always
it's
amazing.
Nuts. Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
how is he doing like Monster and 20th Century Boys at the same time? I don't even know how it's physically possible.
It hurts me. Well, they don't sleep and they don't have social lives, from what I can tell. But yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing an article somewhere about like they had kind of mapped out the schedule that some of the manga creators had.
I posted this about a week ago because I'd seen it like maybe 5 years ago, and I was like laughing at it then, and now it's much more similar to what my life is. And so it's kind of just fun. I mean, it's not nowhere near as bad as that schedule makes it look.
Yeah.
All the time, but
it's pretty crazy though. But I mean, like, I don't think that there's necessarily some sort of universal, like, youth means innovation and, like, age means, like, you have your craft set. Because there's a lot of artists who, I mean, I think there are artists who are fairly similar to who they were when they were younger. And like haven't really changed that much, and that's fine. Like, a lot of them are very popular, and that's totally fine. But there are other ones who, like, you were talking about Stuart Immonen earlier, and that guy, I mean, he can, like, look at Next Wave. I mean, there was that one issue where he switched into like a Mike Mignola style, and he switched into like 3 other different styles.
It's incredible, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's not something that I think you can just do theoretically. I mean, not to downplay you guys and make you sound like you're action figures or something, but out of the box. I mean, it's not something you can just do. And I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of really cool stuff that's out there. Like, have you ever read Emily Carroll, any of her stuff?
I know the name, but I haven't, no.
You should check out some of her webcomics, because she does some really crazy, innovative stuff with her webcomics, and like the way that she approaches story and everything. But I don't know. I mean, I guess it's like I think a lot of it's more dependent on the artist than it is about their age, and I'm sure you would probably agree with that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, arguably, in addition to just the idea of honing one's craft, there's the idea that, like, at Marvel and DC, there's a certain, like, American comics have a certain look. I think it's a much more diverse look in terms of style now than it was 10 years ago or 30 years ago. But a lot of what So I mean, look at like the most popular comics now, which are not in the mainstream, but generally speaking are written for a young or young adult audience. Like the style is very very different than what you see in mainstream comics. It's very for using like the technical artistic term is very primitive in the sense that it's heavily reliant on symbol, not on trying to make people look photorealistic. And that's something that doesn't necessarily require tons and tons of time to develop into a very like sophisticated. It's you can lean heavily into symbol. I'm getting really abstract here. It's a style that maybe doesn't require the tens of thousands of hours of time to be able to nail a nearly photorealistic likeness.
Sure,
but with a very simple drawing, you can convey emotion very very easily, and perhaps tastes within comics and mainstream comics, Big Two, et cetera, have gotten so narrow that you're blocking out the opportunity to express story using a very different style.
Right.
I know that's very like not well articulated and very vague, but
no, it totally made sense. And I think this kind of in a way, like you'd mentioned something about digital like a little while back on Twitter about how like there might be like a perception to a certain degree, and I think that this is degrading to a certain degree. But
Right.
I think that you said that some people perceive digital to be almost like digital art to be lesser. I don't want to say lesser, but like some people think that digital is naturally worse than traditional, and I've heard that firsthand in my comic shop. I've like somebody will like a person who's working there will say something like, "Oh, you can tell that they switched to digital because it's gotten worse." I'm like, "Why has it gotten worse? It looks the same." Anyways, but I was curious though. Why do you think that is? Like, as somebody who works digitally, and I'm sure you could you could do traditional art, but like, why do you think that is?
So first of all, I do a lot of the traditional work still. I mean, at this point, it's primarily just for like commissions, but then also for like covers and splash pages. I always ink traditionally, just so I can have an original to try to sell.
Right.
And I trained traditionally. It wasn't until I was probably in my late 20s when I first started doing digital for comics. I mean, I dabbled in digital before then. I worked as an animator on A Scanner Darkly, a film that came out in like the mid 2000s, and we all worked digitally for that. But the point that I was trying to make is that I have a lot of experience working traditionally, and it very much informs the way that I work digitally.
Sure. Yeah.
To answer your question directly, like I think there are a couple things about digital that kind of lead to that perception. On the one hand, digital, one of its biggest strengths is that it takes a lot of those tasks that are either monotonous or difficult to do quickly in traditional media, and it makes it very, very easy to do digitally.
Yeah.
So as a very simple example, there's always an undo button, right?
Yeah.
And
which would be a curse and a blessing, right?
Exactly, and that's the thing. It's so if it's blessing is that you can if you happen to be working on this one really really fine line on the mouth and you mess it up, well, there are ways of fixing that on a page, but with digital it's very very easy to just undo and redraw it, which for me it's early on especially it can be a crutch. I definitely still use undo. I think I use it far less than I used to, because as you develop as an artist, part of that is learning how to control your hand,
right.
and control the tools you're using. Arguably, one I guess argument or criticism is that people who lean on that too heavily never develop as artists because they're not developing the control. I think that is that may happen some of the time, but I think that most artists don't want to be hitting Control Z all the time, just as much as they don't want to be making a mistake on the page all the time.
Yeah,
I think the same feedback mechanism works.
Yeah, you don't want to lean on the tools too much because then you kind of, I guess, lose some of that craft that we were talking about.
Exactly, yeah. And there are other things. I mean, a lot of people aren't fans of people who use 3D models in digital because they feel as if it's cheating by not building everything from scratch. And with all of these, like, there is a certain nugget of truth in the criticisms, in that these are there are strengths and limitations to all these aspects of digital as a tool set. But by the same token, there are strengths and limitations to the traditional tool set as well.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing is that these limitations and strengths for digital, they're just not the same as what traditional are. And I wouldn't go so far as to say the critics are Luddites, but I think that there is a certain degree of digital is a disruptive innovation, and when you have disruption in anything, technology, in commerce, in art, there's going to be a lot of controversy surrounding it.
Right. Absolutely.
And part of that is important because I do see a lot of crappy digital art. But by the same token, I also see a lot of crappy traditional art.
Yeah, yeah.
And the point that I made on Twitter, and I think a lot of people agree with me on this, is that when people are reacting so strongly against digital art that is not good, I think that the criticism is maybe not entirely wrongly, but at least somewhat wrongly put on the fact that digital is the thing that's making it bad. That isn't necessarily true. It's just digital, like anything else, is just a tool.
Yeah.
And it's incumbent upon the artist, the creator, to make the best use of that tool, make the best art they possibly can. And perhaps I'm being harsh by saying crappy. We all have tons of room to improve, and arguably if an artist is producing art digitally that isn't very good, maybe they're still trying to work out some kinks.
Right.
But some of the fault may lie in that digital it can have a certain look that is not the way that we are used to seeing comic art, and because it's different and maybe not wholly sophisticated yet, it's the blame is placed at the feet of it being digital. I would argue it's maybe a mix of the two. Digital does have some drawbacks, and it can produce art that looks
inorganic
or cold.
Yeah.
And in some cases that can be used to make very interesting art, or it can be unintentionally it can produce bad art. But by the same token, like, the same thing can happen with traditional. So
I actually I think you're completely right. I mean, I think a big part of it is kind of like the rejection of the norm, or like it's going away from something that people have been used to for a really long time. And a lot of times people have a hard time accepting something new. But I really think that, like, some of the best art I've ever seen is digital. Some of the best art I've ever seen is traditional. And the flip side for both of those. And it really just comes down to who's doing it. And, like, a lot of it can kind of come down to fit. Like, there's some artists whose work I don't personally love, but if they're on the right book and it's the right subject, it can fit really well. Like, I don't know, I don't have any examples right offhand, but I mean, those types of things, it can happen. But I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with one way or another. I just think that I don't know. I mean, comics as an industry for a long time has been something that has been very, I don't want to say suspicious of change, but like, a lot of comic readers are not interested in leaving the status quo, and a lot of times digital, even if it doesn't really impact them in any ways, it can mean something different, and that's different than the status quo, which means they like it less. But
I agree. Yeah. I think you're hitting on something really important there, which is like there is an innate conservatism. I'm using that term very specifically. Like, there's an innate conservatism within comics and within superhero comics, and even goes back to, like, there's the whole Stan Lee quote of, like, producing the illusion of change as opposed to change itself.
Yeah.
And I think that it is something. Maybe it has something to do with, like, the collector mentality. Or I have a friend who. And in this, he's speaking of himself and myself and all the rest of our nerdy friends, but he thinks that all nerds have just, like, a certain strain of autism that it makes us all kind of, like, want to hang on to certain details. I don't really agree with that, but it's funnily touching upon something that I think we all recognize within comics nerddom specifically.
We fear change.
Absolutely, and it's. I don't know. I marvel at a lot of traditional art And I look back at the work by the masters, and looking at I have a bunch of artist edition books on my bookshelf. I'm pointing to them, not like you can see that. And looking at through these Wally Wood pages,
Right.
it's just astonishing that the work that these guys did, or guys like Declan Shalvey, or Sean Murphy, or any of the other really kind of like champions of traditional art nowadays who are doing absolutely stellar, incredible work. There's a great deal of value in producing art traditionally, and in perpetuating and continuing that tradition. And I think that for every artist, whether they who does choose to work digitally, I think that it's important to try to understand where the art form comes from, because I think it will inform their work, and it certainly has mine. And for my own sake, I find that when I'm working, whether digitally or traditionally, one informs the other. Having worked digitally for a long time now, I found that I now prefer working oversized when I work traditionally, because it gives me more opportunity to not fight the page but work with the page.
Right.
And likewise, when I work, I used to work on super smooth paper because I wanted a really clean a line when I was drawing. As I started experimenting a bit with rougher brush effects digitally, I started working with rougher paper, and there's a weird feedback mechanism where my digital was informing my traditional, and then finding how my now slightly modified traditional style would look differently on different kinds of paper that would influence the way I wanted to do the digital work. And so everything is an opportunity for growth and exploration. I think maybe the biggest frustration I have when I hear people really criticize digital is it feels as if at times some artists want to control what other artists are doing.
Right.
And that more than the specifics of what they're saying, I think that is something that I just naturally rebel against. For me, I find a great deal of freedom in exploring art digitally, arguably more so than I do traditionally. I feel as if I'm able to explore with a greater sense of confidence, knowing that if I don't like the direction a piece of art is going, I can always mend it.
Right.
Which allows me to play and experiment and explore in a way that I find both very freeing and very gratifying.
Yeah.
And that's all I want for any artist, really, is to be able to find the method of producing work and the tools for producing work that let them do the work they want to in the way that they want to, and get the most joy out of it.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting what digital offers artists in the sense that, like you're talking about the innovation and like the ability to, kind of push your art in different ways, even as you're working, without like sacrificing the page completely or something like that. 'Cause you could always go back, I guess.
Right.
But even beyond that, I mean, like you look at, I don't know if you read it, but I ran an article from Christian Ward talking about switching to digital this week. And he was talking about how Duncan Fegredo and Jamie McKelvey were suggesting he do it, particularly because Duncan Fegredo suggested that digital can be faster. Mm-hmm. And I think, like anything that can, make it so you don't sacrifice your ability to tell a story well, while also being able to, do your art faster and in
Right.
potentially more interesting ways. I feel like digital, I'm not saying it's some sort of magic solve that's going to fix everything or something, but I feel like that could do a lot of great things for both artists and the art form. And I think that's really cool.
I absolutely agree. And the speed thing specifically, I think it ties into what I was saying earlier about taking a lot of monotony and time-consuming aspects of traditional work, and if not eliminating it, then certainly abbreviating that. I work 3 to 5 times faster digitally than I do traditionally.
Wow.
Now maybe that's because I tend to have a pretty tight, precise style, at least most of the time. And when I'm working traditionally, I have to be very careful not to fuck up a line. Mm-hmm. And arguably, if I had stuck to working fully traditionally, that would be less the case. But if you look at a lot of artists, like the guys who influenced me, like a Travis Charest, mm-hmm. Or like a Brian Hitch. Maybe Brian Hitch is not quite as good of an example, but certainly Travis Charest is not a fast artist at all. So it's precious when you get new work out of him. I like being able to produce tight, technically precise work without having to be precious about the work that I'm producing. I'm able to draw very quickly, and in a style that would normally take a lot longer. I mean, when I switched digital, this is before I really broke in. The result, to keep it short, I was trying to break in for years and years and years. It wasn't happening. My girlfriend, then now wife, suggested that since I have these digital tools laying around from my days on Scanner, maybe you should just try doing these in comics.
Sure.
And immediately I found that I could produce the art that I wanted to in much more quickly. And then within a year, maybe within 18 months, I was working at Marvel. And 5 years now later, my career has gotten to this point. And there's no way I could have covered that ground as quickly as I had, or really I think evolved as an artist as quickly as I had I not chosen to explore digital as a tool for art creation. Not only because I was able to produce quickly, but I was able to produce well, maybe this does tie into being fast as well, but I was able to develop a reputation for being reliable and producing high quality work.
I think one thing you said in there, was really, really fascinating in the sense that, I think that if you ask an average comic fan, or let's say that one of those, comic fans that's a little bit more stuck in their ways as far as traditional art is the way to go because it's the way it is. That's the way it's always been, so it should be. But I think if you ask one of them, they would say one of the things is it's raw and it's got more traditional art allows you to get a more pure form of it. But I think for what you're saying, when you're working traditionally, you were having to be a lot more careful because you're kind of you're afraid of screwing up the page by doing the wrong line because there's no undo button and ink.
Right.
I feel like it sounds to me like it allows you in a way to be more raw with your art in interesting ways.
It definitely allows me to well, maybe what I was saying earlier, I feel more confident and I feel more free when I'm working digitally, and I'm not stressing about the work I'm doing. I'm able to just kind of draw without having to. It's like drawing without boundaries. Maybe is
Sure.
the best way of saying it. Now that said, I have a style where I care about having lines precise down to less than a millimeter at times.
Yeah.
And there are artists who have a much looser brush, or one could say more dynamic, or maybe more rough, raw style.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so looking at the two guys I was mentioning earlier, guys, Declan and Sean Murphy, these are guys who absolutely have control over their craft, 100%. But they also have styles, I think, that lend to the benefits of traditional work. That isn't to say someone with a very tight technical style wouldn't benefit or doesn't benefit from the way they approach their art if they're doing it traditionally. But certainly from my experience, it was that I was able to better achieve my goals using a digital tool set rather than using a traditional tool set.
Yeah.
But by going back every once in a while and kind of dipping back in the well of traditional, I'm able to, to keep it alive and fresh and find other different ways of approaching what my goal is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I would say that in a weird way, the biggest sacrifice somebody like you would make, I guess you work on splashes still in original.
Yeah.
It's just the fact that you lose the art sales. And I guess from a sheer economic standpoint that's a bummer, but you make up for it by being able to work faster and more reliably, which means you can be on a project for longer. And so it's kind of there's pros and cons to both sides, but it sounds like you've kind of figured it out to a point where you can kind of have your cake and eat it too.
You hit it right on the head. I mean, when I first went digital, the idea of original sales wasn't even part of the equation. I was just trying to break into comics.
Sure.
Period. Right.
Yeah.
There was a certain point where I started, looking around at my peers who had, stacks of
Bristol board everywhere.
Right.
Yeah.
And for a lot of artists, it's a big portion of their income.
Yeah.
And I was having a conversation with another artist about this recently, and there are pros and cons, and so if the negative, like you said, is that I don't have the originals, the positives I can produce more quickly. And for me, they're overwhelmingly, I am happy with my decision.
Mm-hmm.
Because I could have, right now I produce between 10 and 12 books a year, full issues, and arguably I can produce a little bit faster than that, depending on kind of what style I'm pursuing, whether I have more bare bones or more really detailed. But that's a very, very fast turnover. I mean, I have a 4.5 week deadline on my monthly books. Most artists, especially those who ink themselves, take at least 5, if not 6.
Mm-hmm.
I've been able to do a series of unbroken runs on Miles Morales over the past several years. These are all, and I'm saying this, these are the benefits of the way I've chosen to work.
Yeah.
And looking at the financial side of things, it means that I have a fairly steady, reliable paycheck coming in. It means I have more trades on the shelf, which means whenever those trades go on at Marvel and DC, we get a small percentage of that as a it's not technically a royalty, but it's you can call it that, I guess.
Yeah.
And so these things make up for not having the original to sell. And that said, I do have covers that sell. I have
Like the all new, all different, like character. I don't know what you call that, like character poster, like teaser.
Yeah, the promo image. Yeah. I did each of those individually, and I have those to sell. And there are commissions. There are lots of different ways to kind of get alternate revenue streams going.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, the biggest benefit of it is that I got to go within the span of about 6 years to not being published at all to working on a really big, important book at Marvel.
That's a hell of a thing.
And that never would have happened had I not been able to develop professionally because of my ability to produce work, thanks to the tools that I use.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it is a sufficient condition for having a fast career progression, but in my case, I think it was absolutely. I don't know. It worked for me.
I do think that like one of the most underrated characteristics an artist or really anyone in comics can have is reliability. And
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, like, I was talking with somebody today, it's like, for every nobody, like Frank Whiteley and John Cassidy are amazing artists, but they don't do really long runs because they just can't do it, really.
Right.
And not everyone, like, if your average artist who is breaking in worked the same way, they just couldn't do it. But, like, having the ability to, like you said, put out 10 to 12 issues every year or do an unbroken run, I actually think that, like, being able to do an unbroken run like you did, it's so rare today.
It's few and far between. I mean, the one thing I'll say about the reliability is that speed and reliability need not necessarily be the same thing, because the way I've heard the guys who do scheduling at Marvel talk about it is like, if it takes you six weeks or 7 weeks or 8 weeks or 3 months to draw a book, if we want you to draw a book and we know that that's your schedule, we can plan around that.
Sure.
And so there's a balance between speed, quality of work, and then professionalism is kind of its own thing. Part of it factors into do you produce your top level work all the time? That's part of professionalism. Also, part of it is just like don't be a schmuck and don't lie to somebody about what you can do. Right.
I'm always amazed when like there's like the I think this was happening at like WonderCon this year, and like there was some artists who were like,
I heard about this, yeah,
tweeting instead of like doing their work, even though they were like behind deadlines. And I'm like, what are you doing? You're on the internet. They can see you.
What's funny? So Brian and I were both not at WonderCon. We saw it happening, so we started texting to each other like, "Do you know who he's talking about?"
It was CB Swolsky, wasn't it?
I never found out who it was, but what's funny is that apparently I knew that I wasn't there, but a lot of artists who were at WonderCon who worked for Marvel were all texting CB like, "Are you talking about me? I swear I hit my deadline." Yeah, it was funny, but no, it's the point you make is a good one. I mean, there are a lot of artists who just don't work quickly and are able to then, because of they've established a very strong reputation, or because they produce just such incredible work, they carve out a niche for themselves doing like special projects or doing launches and that kind of stuff. Like your John Cassaday's, guys like this, where they do incredible work, their name sells, and they are put to work by guys like Marvel or DC, where they'll do the most good, so to speak, which is
launching
John,
Star Wars.
Well, right, exactly, and selling 1 million copies, which is freaking nuts. But Iron Man's selling well, so I really have no place to bitch.
You only sold 300,000. Jeez.
That still hasn't sunk in. But so it's for myself, I never looked back. Well, that isn't true. I hem and haw over this kind of stuff all the time. Like, am I producing art the best way possible? And part of it is because, like I said earlier, like I tend to be constantly looking for different ways of doing art, and part of that is because I'm not always convinced the way I'm doing is right.
Right.
And I try to use that as avenue for growth. I just encourage any other artist who is debating, should I draw traditionally? Should I draw digitally? Who cares? Draw the way that you like. There are plenty of artists I know who, having seen the way that I responded so positively to working digitally, they just tried it out and they just didn't like it in the end.
Yeah.
Or they found maybe they didn't like inking digitally, but they loved penciling traditionally. There are tons of artists, especially working at Marvel and DC, who find that the strengths of digital really help them out when they're penciling or when they're doing the roughs or the layouts, and they find when they come to finishing they like doing that traditionally.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just find the tools that you enjoy and make good work.
Yeah, well, the thing for me is, so I play a lot of basketball. I'm a big basketball fan, and I was talking to somebody, like, I'm fairly good at shooting. I'm not going to say I'm like Stephen Curry or something like that, but I like, somebody asked me like, oh, how do you shoot? And like, like just asking about my like form and stuff, because I shoot really awkwardly. But, to me, it's like for basketball, like, I think that form matters less than, whether or not you're comfortable with what you're doing. And I think that works the same way with art. And, it's good to find, like you found out early on that, like, you can work faster and better digitally. And, like, some people work mixed format, some people work this way, people work that. But, it really is seemingly all about, what works for you. And I don't know. I mean, I think that's why maybe the youth isn't about innovation so much as it is about experimentation and figuring out who you are so you can work into that craft.
Absolutely. No, it's everyone hated it when Dylan went electric, but it's important for artists to continue to evolve and change. And I think that nothing is more saddening than seeing an artist who just doesn't give a shit anymore.
Right.
And for myself, at the very least, I don't see that happening anytime soon. And for most of the artists who I'm friends with, actually, I'd probably say all the artists I'm friends with, and I'm sure most artists, it is constantly wanting to improve that keeps them drawing.
Mm-hmm.
Very few of us ever look at our work and be like, nailed it, done, 30 years of my life, this is all is coming to this moment now I can rest easy. It's there's a constant drive to improve and to explore, and that's the fun of it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, David, I think that's all I have for you, but thank you so much for coming on and talking art with me and Iron Man and everything. And I'm, I wish you all the best in launching the book and everything that comes after that.
Oh, thanks, man. No, this was a blast, really good conversation. Good chance to get a whole lot of stuff off my chest, so thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Off Panel from Sketch.com. You can find this week's guest, David Marquez, on his website at davidmarquez.com, on Twitter at Dave Marquez, as well as Invincible Iron Man #1 on shelves October 7th. Find other episodes of Off Panel and more on Sketched. That's SKTCHD.com. Follow us on Twitter at SketchedComic and like us on Facebook at /Sketched. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.